at the front. You come down to the front. A very warm welcome to you all on what is possibly the last day of summer. Great that you've come inside for this lecture this evening. I'm Teresa Marteau, and as you will see in your leaflet for this talk, I'm one of 4 co-investigators on a programme of research funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is looking at changing environments in order to change behaviour to improve health. And you can learn more about that in the leaflet and going online. So it's a great pleasure this evening to introduce David Halpern, who is giving our first annual lecture. And David, as I think most people here will know, is the Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team, also known as the Nudge Unit. And also National Advisor for the What Works Network. David, I think, single-handedly has done more to raise the profile of behavioural science, not just across our government, but governments across the world. And I think that that is seen in the way that policymakers are much more likely to frame problems now in terms of behaviour and wanting to find solutions that involve changing behaviour and working in not just developing but introducing interventions that have been tried elsewhere, and importantly setting up some evaluation to see how those might work. I think David's been particularly successful bringing a set of skills and experiences that are quite rare. First of all, in terms of academic background, he studied here in natural sciences, specialising in experimental psychology. Those were in the days before Cambridge had a degree or tripos in psychological and behavioural sciences, which it now does have. And worked in various academic posts in this university, Oxford, and also in Harvard. And that, with that academic background, he then was immersed in the policy world, where he has been for nearly 20 years, including being analyst at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, and in 2010 setting up the Behavioural Insights team, where he has been since. Originally that was based in the Cabinet Office, and much of the work of that unit has been written about in the book published, I think, 2016, Inside the Nudge Unit, Small Changes for Big Differences. I'm looking to David, right? As I say, the work of the unit is well known, and it's been copied, not just by the unit itself replicating in different jurisdictions across the world, but also many other government departments and countries setting up their own units. It's not without controversy, both the nature of the interventions and some of the work of the team. So I'm hoping that David may touch on some of that, but also during our discussion, some of that might come up. So without further ado, David, you're most welcome to give our first annual lecture.
Thanks. Hi, it's great to be here. I've got a couple of books actually. One is I just got a kind of nice original copy of, well, not fully original, but of James Lynn's book on Treatise on Scurvy, which we'll come back to maybe a little bit later. I'd be very pleased if Inside the Nudge Unit is in a leather-bound copy in 250 years' time. Someone still thinks it's worth looking at. Probably not. Anyway, very nice to be here. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to quite rapidly go through a kind of very basic introduction. I'm not going to do much behavioural science. I can assume people know the 101 about the basic idea, but maybe I could talk. I mean, how many people have read Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow? I won't ask who hasn't then. So that seems a reasonable assumption. I'll give some very simple examples on essentially what you might call kind of classic nudges, actually, in health. We do them in many other domains too. Then what I want to do is sort of move into how we use it in relation to fundamental policy design. Teresa and others often, Teresa, I should say, has long been involved one way or another in the team on our advisory board, which needs to meet again soon. Being robust as well as helpful, of course. But one of the arguments often is made more generally as a criticism is, the limitations of a nudge per se. And I just wanted at least to kind of pull back the curtain a bit and show you a lot of our work is actually kind of core policy design, which goes much broader than what you might call a nudge. And then maybe just talk a little bit about what is kind of the most interesting frontier areas now that we're thinking about, and maybe some of you guys will go on and think about too. Okay, so I won't talk so much about what works, but why do I do that? Again, just to kind of quickly address it, but there are two aspects of what we're basically doing, not very complicated. One is introducing a more realistic model of human behaviour. The other is we sort of smuggled into government a strong form of empiricism. And even if you didn't care about the behavioural science, that bit's really worth doing. So I thought I'd just, for at least a few seconds, talk about, Teresa mentioned, actually I also not only did natural science, I came back to university and did a PhD in social and political sciences, looking at actually behavioural impacts of design, literally design. I wrote a book a long time ago on this. In fact, this was one, I did a number of studies back then, when I was the age of many of you in the audience, but including literally looking at the effects, I said, of physical design, such as street layout. So there's a kind of quasi-experimental design. I just quickly mentioned one of them, which was in Peterborough. And it's an interesting, so this is literally truly design. This is something that's called a Radburn layout, for those who are interested in these things. It's, and one of the characteristics, it was developed in the 1940s and 50s when cars were getting more and more prevalent. And what has footpaths that go through the estates, see, to the front doors, a bit like Downing, actually. And you can't bring your car in here. And then the back is supported by roads, and that's where the vehicles go. And so the idea is it'd be a really great design. Everybody would kind of be able to walk around safely and, and walk their kids to school and not get run over and blah, blah, blah. Of course, what actually happens when you put real human beings in it is quite often is they just drive their cars and only ever use the back door. Anyway, so it was a natural experiment. I was looking for where money was being spent on different estates, and it happened to be in Peterborough on this particular layout, which is an interesting one, where they decided to make a number of physical changes, and it was on particularly around this floor close, where they were going to block off alleyways and make other changes, and the question is how would it change behaviour as a consequence. So I won't go into lots of detail, but it turns out it does a lot. And one of the kind of cascade of consequences, I was particularly looking at levels of depression and anxiety, which are incredibly high in a lot of these populations who are quite isolated. But it really did have quite interesting and dramatic effects. So closing off the alleyways, what it did is it changed. Look, if you take an area like, in fact, let's take this block here. You can see there's sort of 60-odd houses, nearly, opening onto this one area, yeah? And so what it means is, one of the key points that you find is about human social interaction is that just making people bump into each other, forcing interaction doesn't lead to good interaction. When you're stuck together on the underground in someone else's armpit, it doesn't necessarily mean you warm to humanity, except physically. But what's the consequences? When you shut off these alleyways, what it means, there were a number of other changes, I'll just talk about this one, is that when you see someone in front of your house, before they were quite likely to be someone who's just cutting through, but afterwards they are very, very much more likely just to be a neighbour. So it leads to a sort of domino consequence around social interaction. And over, basically tracked it for 2 years, you'd see on this particular close significant reductions in anxiety and depression at the same time as essentially social interaction was increasing in trust between the neighbours. So there's a really good history here. So I was delighted that other people are thinking about these things. Okay, so jumping forward to 2010, as Teresa said, there was a decision in the coalition government to, in the words of the coalition, do this stuff. find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. It did have a very particular political context, which is the government was also kind of bankrupt. We had a structural deficit of 8%, which is enormous. And also it was centre-right government, which was generally looking for alternatives to regulation. So these two things come together and they set the climate for doing something slightly different. I won't go into detail, but there was also work going on inside government administratively to say we should use these techniques as well. And these kind of came together politically as well as administratively. So we set up the Behavioural Insight team. It was set up for a 2-year sunset clause on the basis that if it didn't work, it would be shut down. In fact, it would be shut down automatically unless it achieved at least a 10-fold return on the cost of the unit, etc. You can read about that inside the nudge unit if you like. Anyhow, we had lots of help. We had lots of help from people like Teresa. Richard Thaler was particularly involved, as was Cass and others from the US. Of course, Richard would be delighted, got the Nobel Prize this year, which is great, including, of course, reference to the Behavioural Insight team, which is very nice. So, almost legitimate. I won't go lots of examples. I'm going to use mainly health examples, actually, but we worked in lots of different areas and continue to do so. We've, I think, initiated now more than 700 trials, to give you a sense of the scale. This is one of the very early famous ones, and it's a tax letter. It had already been simplified, shortened, and I'm sure none of you have ever received a letter like this because you always pay your tax on time, but if you are late and you're self-assessed, you would get one. And essentially what we tested is the effectiveness of adding one extra line into the letter using the existing management information of HMRC. So does adding a line, and depending on what you say on it, make people more likely who are late paying their tax to then pay it without any further prompt? So this particular one has become quite famous. 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, which, by the way, is true. Interesting general bias is we overestimate bad behaviour in other people. So we systematically overestimate the number of people who don't pay their taxes, who take a sickie off work, etc. Nice recent book on this is Bobby Duffy's. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, if you're interested. So does it make a difference? So we run this randomized controlled trial. We compare the nice simplified version to other variants. And we're using this measure because we're using HMRC owned data. So there's our control. You can see just over 33% pay their tax on time. Adding the extra line, does it make a difference? 9 out of 10. It turns out, yes, it does. You're even more influenced by people who are like you. So when we say most people in Cambridge pay their tax on time, which we would check to be true, even better. If we flip it around, for those who know the social norm literature, actually the key thing you often want to do is to say the problematic behaviour is the exceptional one. So we say, you're one of the few people yet to pay your tax on time. That's even better. And if we say most people in your area pay their tax on time, you're one of the few yet to do so, now we're at a 5 percentage point increase or 15% left up. So why is that a very big deal? You can imagine literally presenting this to a group of quite skeptical senior civil servants or ministers, but when they see this, they're not dummies. They realize the marginal cost of the extra line of letter is not high. And if you can get this kind of extra uplift when you're in the business of collecting, I mean, this was just done just on a block of 600 million outstanding personal tax. You get very big effect sizes. So, right. One of the early areas, right from the very beginning, was, of course, we should do this on health. You know, we all kind of, certainly in this room, you'll know that a very large proportion of years of healthy life lost are to behavioural factors. Diet, smoking, drinking, unsafe sex, etc. Let alone when we work out years of preventable, lives lost, you get these massive effects. And one of the puzzles that sits over this, by the way, the one exception, if you're worrying, that's alcohol, which David Spiegelhal will tell you about. Little doses of actually could be good. Anyway, why do we spend all our money on secondary care and pharmaceuticals when this is where most of the variance is? It's a really interesting question, which is fantastic that Teresa and Cambridge continue to think about this. Okay, so with that in mind, let's dunk into some quite concrete, simple examples. And then if you're still with me, we'll move on to some more advanced policy questions. So we sometimes use a very simple mnemonic, and I know it's crass, but we're often working with policymakers and we're just trying to get them to use this stuff in a simple way. So the ability to absorb it is important. So EAST, it's an EAST mnemonic, if you haven't heard it. Easy, attractive, social, timely. So I'll just quickly give an example from health in each of these sort of areas. So easy, just basically, so defaults in pensions is an example, one famous one. Simplification, just obsessively removing friction. So particularly classical economic models are oddly, let's put it politely, neglectful of frictional factors. So the reason why you haven't switched your energy supplier for many people is because you had to fill out a form and look up some data, and these frictions are often deliberately added in fact, sometimes. So, and that's a kind of pathway, in fact, literally design feature. Before you put your paths down, you work out where does everybody go, and then you put your paths down afterwards, so-called paths of desire. It's a famous example. I actually often use this for non-health audiences because I think it illustrates the point so well, which is the reduction in suicide in Britain that occurred from the late 1950s. Again, in this audience, you probably know a lot of it, but it was 7 years straight, more or less, falls, 25% odd, and a lot of debate at the time about what was driving these remarkable falls in suicide in both men and women. Of course, you don't know. Do you know the answer? Which it was the discovery of North Sea oil lowers the suicide rate, and which is kind of puzzling for most people. But the reason is because one of the ways that people would kill themselves is they put their head in the oven, literally. Turn on the oven. Those who don't know this bit of data. And put your head in it, and it would kill you. And the reason why it killed you is because there was lots of carbon monoxide in gas in the 40s and even early 50s because it was derived from coal. But when North Sea oil comes on stream, you've got natural gas. It doesn't have so much carbon monoxide. So when we break down the suicide rate for this is from carbon monoxide related poisoning, you can see it collapses over the period. But what's really striking is very little increase in every other form of suicide, particularly for men, for some reason extremely lazy. So, this is the most important decision you might make in your life, whether to end it. Turns out to be very strongly affected by frictional factors, which we know in other forms, in terms of if you sell pills and you have to actually take one out at a time as opposed to a big bottle, you lower the suicide rate from that cause. So friction really matters, making it easy. Here's a simple example applied in the NHS. So when you go and see your GP and they say you need an operation and they say where you're going to go to, one of the striking things is GPs will often refer people to a hospital, often of course a local hospital, that has really long waits. And the puzzle is why don't they, there's another one just a few miles away, why don't they refer people? Because they're looking at something which is often quite complicated to read, just literally absorb. It's hard to get the information. So we do some, reworking basically. This is classic choice architecture design, where you can see, look, not very complicated, but instead of just having the weight there, it has a little red box saying limited capacity on the areas that have got really long waits. And they can still click on it. There's no reason, nothing to stop them doing it. If they do, there's a little pop-up. That's all that happens. And it says, are you sure you want to do this? You've selected one service where the patient is unlikely to receive treatment within 18 weeks. You sure you want? And they can just click yes if they want to. Does it make a difference? Yes, it does. Quite a big difference. So adding the alerts, you can see, leads to, well, this is just kind of sense of the scale, significant, reduction in the number of people who refer, GPs in this case. So it doesn't have to be grand stuff. It can be simple stuff. Attractive, does it matter? Yeah, lots of aspects to this, and this includes things like the relative salience, the messenger effect, who's telling you this thing, do you believe them, personalization, just literally, do they use your name, do they not, etc. In fact, even behind this is quite a nice illustration from work. We do work in a lot of other countries. We didn't do this intervention, but we did quickly do a kind of back of an envelope evaluation on it. And it's Southern Cross Station in Melbourne. Any Australians in the audience today? Yes, so you might recognize this. So you see that clearer. So there's this fantastic, huge set of stairs, and we can't quite see, but at the edge there are these sort of escalators, or that people go up and down, like that. And they partly did it for kind of just fun, cool thing. They put this massive, great picture over it, and so we were interested, does it change people's behaviour? And it turns out it does. So it leads to about 25% increase in the number of people who take the steps during peak times, and more than doubling in off-peak times when you can see the whole picture. Just looks nice, so you want to go up it. In fact, it was so effective that after it was there for a month or so, it was replaced with a very large advert for Coke. Oh well. Okay, here's another sort of make it attractive. So this is a kind of controversial one, which is should you use incentives? Again, sometimes people say, as a nudge and incentive, we don't really care. We're interested in behavioural science and what moves people's behaviour. So this is, again, an Australian trial, which we were doing on breast cancer. I won't go through all the details of it, but we use a number of changes, but one of which is we experiment with using incentive. So, this is particularly people who've missed a number of, breast exams, they've missed appointments, and then you say, well, if, come along and have this exam, and we'll enter you into a lottery for a free iPad, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. I remember arguing with an old colleague when I worked for Tony Blair, Paul Corrigan, who was a very senior special advisor on health. And I was saying, we need to be, because we did have a go at doing this a long time ago, come back to it later if you want, about, we should look at other kinds of ways to shape human behavior, like get people to quit smoking and so on, like better designed incentives. And he's like, what are you talking about, David? If you don't change your behavior, you die. What more of an incentive are you going to work out? Except it turns out that is exactly what human beings are like. Is it possible that just saying to someone, hey, we'll put you into this thing, you might win an iPad, versus actually you might have a scan because you might die otherwise, would it make a difference? Well, guess what the answer is? So we do a couple of variations. We say, and you could win an iPad Air. Actually, we also do a variation, which we thought some people, instead of just for yourself, you do, for yourself or an inspirational woman right? It's forgiving. It's like, I'm not doing myself. Okay. Yeah, does it work? Yeah, it works plenty. So first of all, we get a big uplift, by the way, I'm not going into the details, by just rewriting the letter using behavioural principles. Clarity, salience, I won't go through all the details. Oh, we also did these further variations saying, if in addition we do the prize draw, do we get any marginal effect? And the answer is yes. Not a difference between the two variants, actually, but is it worth doing? And then, of course, you can just calculate it. Well, how much does it cost? How many extra people do we get? What is that margin? So on and so on. Attractive, makes a difference. Social, we're incredibly social creatures, so we are influenced by what everybody else is doing. Sometimes called declarative social norms as opposed to injunctive norms, telling you what the rules should be. Lots of examples of these, so it includes, social norms, networks, reciprocity, if I help you, would you help me back? Lots of examples you can use in health. Active commitments, you get someone to say, actually, we'll do this. Even simple cues about other people like eyes and faces. Here's a simple example. One of the questions is, you're busy nudging, actually sometimes the public to do things, but often we're actually nudging clinicians. So this is one published in The Lancet, and some of you will know it, where we were trying to reduce overprescription of antibiotics. And essentially what we did is using a social norm. So we identify GPs who are at the 20% who are prescribing the most antibiotics, and basically we just write to them and say, you might even have a letter, haven't got it, but you might want to know, you prescribe more than 80% of other GPs. Of course, you might have sick patients, and that's fair enough, whatever, but actually it just gives you this reference point. We used some other techniques in there, so the letter was signed by Sally Davis, the Chief Medical Officer, and it goes off, but that's the only intervention. The other thing I'm not putting up, actually, we also got the department to analyse, they were running this big campaign, and we managed to change it into a randomised controlled trial, which is a classic sort of thing where they would send out all these posters. It had a big tongue on it with a kind of antibiotic on it, and, with a big slogan saying, I don't know, something like uncomfortable truth hard to swallow or something, I don't know. And they would send out all these leaflets and blah, 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 and put it in waiting rooms. It doesn't do anything at all. And it was going to be a 20 million campaign. So in comparison, we're doing something very feeble, which is we're sending one letter to GPs, which is tell these ones who are overprescribing where they are relative to others. Actually, it's GP practices, which we can come back to. Does it make a difference? Well, so our control group, we've got seasonal variation. We've got to take that out. But let's have a look. There's our control group, and then there's the intervention group. So it's about 4% reduction, and it sustains itself, you can see, for 6 months. Just to double check, because we then do at the end of the 6 months is we send the letter to the GPs who didn't get it, the control group. So once again, there we go, seeing it, and actually you get this nice little reconvergence. The Australians, incidentally, have replicated this, and we could only send the letter to GP practices, but they were able to send it directly to individual GPs and give them their use, and they get a 12% reduction, which is really nice. Yeah. Here's another one. I also wanted to say, look, sometimes things don't work as well. So I thought, let me just remind you that. Here's a really nice, this one does work. There's another one I can show you doesn't work. Sorry. just grab that. There's another variation of the same. It's a more recent one you might not have seen, which we've been doing in Manchester, which is another issue is GPs under-referring people actually on cancer to specialists. So we identify the GP practices that are most under-referring, and we just tell them that that's the case, and does it make a difference? And the answer is yes, it does. Actually, it's quite a nice, clear effect. And there's our projections on the impact quite a lot, basically. Because we don't see any, we were trying to look for any evidence, is there, you know, at the margin, are we seeing any reduction in the kind of accuracy? And the answer is no. Okay, timely. Lots of examples of this, you know, priming, framing, effects, key moments is the one. You know, when is someone most likely, normally because their behaviour is being disrupted for other reasons, to change their habit? A simple everyday example is when you have the tube strike in London, you've got commuters who've been commuting for years and years and years, and yet 5% of them don't go back to their previous route. So, but it takes the disruption of forcing them to, oh God, I'm going to have to walk or do something different. And then many of them discover there's a better route, right? So disruption of behaviour. The plot actually behind it is a kind of fun example. It's Google searches for the word diet across time. And as you can see, this is a yearly cycle. And guess where Christmas is? Yeah. So if you're going to do that, don't talk about diets before, but just after, maybe a good idea. Okay, this again a simple example before we go into the more complex one, which is just could we reduce missed appointments? And we're doing some further variations on this now by just prompting people before. Not very complicated. You send them a text with 2 variations about it, see which ones are more effective, and what kind of results we get. That's the number of missed appointments. This was done with Imperial and elsewhere. For control, just giving a number to call, telling them that most people let us know. Actually, the best we found was just telling people specifically what's the cost. It costs the NHS this much for an appointment, blah, 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 blah. And actually, we did further variations. It matters to be as specific as you can. So quite a decent effect. Oh yeah, I said I'd say one that doesn't work. Here's one, just to remind us. So this is a recent bit of work we were doing, fairly recent, on trying to encourage people to do something other than take their kids to A&E. Right? It's a classic demand problem. And so you know, someone keeps bringing their kids to A&E. What happens if you've got a repeat case? You send them a letter, basically, you know, to so-and-so, and it basically sets out, if I can get it to work, you know, if you've got an unwell child, these are some other questions. You might want to use 111, and here's a very simple checklist, right? That's the idea. We send them, and then maybe they'll think about doing something else rather than just taking the kid back to A&E. This is the overall effect. It's not significant. We did actually in the protocol say we want to look within groups, and there are some differences. I'll just show you them actually just out of curiosity. So there's a really big gender difference. I don't know. For some, on the face of it, it works really well to stop people bringing their boys in, but it actually backfires for girls. I don't know. That's the great thing about randomized controlled trials. They tell you certain things, some things they just like, oh, more questions. Anyway, there you go. Something for someone's PhD. All right, so from trials, so that's kind of familiar. They're little kind of prompts, nudges. They can be pretty significant when you add them up, particularly. But one of the things I at least wanted to drive home today is that this stuff is very much more than that in a lot of our practice. And I'll particularly use the example of obesity, which is dear to many of our hearts, thinking about this policy issue. So one of the things that sits behind obesity, right, is this famous foresight map. Again, many of you will have seen. And it's also very striking. I've seen this in a number of places, weird and wonderful through the years. One of the most prominent was, I remember going to see David Curry, Lord Curry, who was then chair of Ofcom, the regulator for you know, media, mobile phones, etc. And it wasn't anything to do with obesity. And I was, you know, he had this very nice office, and in the middle of it, he had this glass table, and he got this really big version of this printed underneath the glass. Like it's your centerpiece in the room. It's like, David, it's a bit weird. Why have you got that? He's like, oh God, you would not believe the number of people who come into my office and explain to me how the problem with X or Y or Z is to do with advertising and you really need to do something about it. So this is so helpful because I can just say, look, we're this little arrow in here in this box and there's all this other stuff. So give me a break, basically. Of course, what's fascinating about this kind of, in fact, literally this Actually, Susan, you probably did half of this. I'm thinking about it. It's a very good piece of work. But it also has often the effect on many people, as you'll have discovered through the years, of like, well, my bit is only this, or my bit is only that. It's all so complicated. Like, what's the point of even getting out of bed in the morning? And that's really, because that is, of course, is a representation of a lot of the world. But nonetheless, you want to really understand these patterns well enough to work out what's a key pressure point that would make a difference. So we've been thinking about this for a little while. And one of the things we did a bit of work for Jeremy Hunt, circa 2013, late 13 or so, and where we tried to work out from quite a reading of the literature and evidence what kind of interventions would work to really move the dial on obesity. And of course, one of the ones we look at are price effects. We've spent a long time crawling through loads and loads of Cantor and other data to look at these natural experiments and variations that occur around price to figure out what essentially the elasticity curve is, which is interesting. Our conclusion was very strongly non-linear as the main point. So if you move, so this is the implied tax rate or derived from prices, how much would it move calories on, you see what I mean? If it costs this much more, how much do you get? And the main thing is it's strongly non-linear, as I said. And why do we think that happens is because consumers don't notice small changes, and also retailers and producers can conceal them in other ways, right? A small price variation in some shop. Until it becomes, you can't ignore it anymore, and then it becomes this sort of resurgent linear effect. Huge amount of work to produce this graph. So this is modeling the impact on tax on sugar soft drinks in about 2013, 14. I know we're on film, aren't we? So I've got to be a bit careful. Anyway, so Jeremy was very interested in this. Kind of, okay, you sort of persuaded me, but you'll never persuade the PM, and we're never going to do this on this side of the election. In other words, for what turned out to be the 2015 election. Anyway, we'll leave it for now. So we then go on to do lots of other very detailed work, as well as drawing on other evidence. So this is, again, actually an Australian trial. It's funny how many trials we did on this in Australia, where we just literally changed positions of different products. So this is on drinks again, and we just put the high sugar drinks sort of a bit harder to reach, basically. And then we look at what occurs, and we're looking for the substitution effects too. And this is what happens. So that actually the red, the most unhealthy drinks, the sales fall dramatically, and then you get the substitution. Interestingly, the substitution often jumping from here to here is quite neat empirically. Importantly, it showed that there was no overall reduction in sales. It's almost perfect substitution. And the guy, this actually is a small curiosity, this was done literally in the Alfred Hospital in Australia. They were really worried that they're going to have all these really angry people saying, what the hell, why do you keep hiding the Coke kind of thing? So they did some survey work. About 1 in 200 people even noticed. So that's partly the power of choice architecture, as you really don't attend to it. Of course, we were interested in price too, various other things. So we wanted to look at price variability. Interesting backstory is we wanted to, Teresa might even remember this, I don't know. We wanted to test by varying the prices in vending machines. In fact, the Treasury building, which is a lot of the team was based around this time, has this huge building, like a quarter of a mile long, and has all these vending machines. So we wanted to do it there, but we actually couldn't persuade various figures and to allow us in the Treasury to vary the prices. So once again, fortunately, the Australians were up for it. So we did these price variations in vending machines, and they're far enough away in the institution that, you know, can you really be bothered to walk across? And then we're looking for the effects. And then in this case, we're looking at 20% variation. And what does it do? It's actually pretty close to some of our modeling work. We're getting 10% substitution. And again, very, very nice sense of substitution across. Now, you might not care about this, but you're politically trying to make an argument about what will be the impact on industry. You're going to get in a lot of big battles about exactly what will be the pattern of the substitution or not. In other words, are you just going to wipe us out because no one will buy drinks anymore? Of course, if you look at other things, this actually was a UK trial where we use not very subtle signs saying, you know, high sugar. There's this argument from Hungary that the reason why their sugar tax and fat tax work is because you had to put big stickers on them. This is done in some local areas. Does it make a difference? Yeah, a bit. It's not a huge effect, but it's just about in there. Obviously depends on the sample size there, where you can see about 36,000. So But why are we looking at all this stuff? It's not just because we're going to go around and literally stick all these labels on. What we're trying to do is build up our confidence about how the model and how the behavior is working and the particular actors. We spend loads of time understanding the industry behaviors, understanding what the retailers are doing and how they position and work out their prices and so on. And of course, partly it's going back to direct stuff, but a lot of it is around if people's behavior is so-called mindless, inert, they don't notice, then we have to do most of the heavy lifting on a nudge which is actually directed at the producers to drive the reformulation. We have a cute name for it. We call it a double nudge. So we've got to move enough marginal consumers that it persuades the retailers and others that they really want to reformulate, basically. See what I mean? And then the beauty of it is most people's behavior doesn't have to change. An interesting aside, by the way, one of the big arguments of Teresa and others will know, but was we had a big wrangle with IFS who said, that's all bullshit. Look at the calorie numbers. It's not true. It's all to do with exercise and the changing nature of work. So we had quite a big side bit of work, particularly done by one of my colleagues, Hugo, where we concluded the national statistics on how much we eat have to be wrong, particularly using double-labeled water and so on, by a large margin, like a sort of 50% error. Because if those true calorie numbers were right, then A&E would be full of people stumbling in, emaciated, having not eaten enough, which didn't seem to be a pressing problem in Britain. But it just tells you, why do I tell you that story? Is because it tells you that we're so inattentive to what we eat that even a lot of our data, especially of course often built on diary studies, people just don't notice what they've eaten. And so even built into our statistics is this error and problem. Okay, so what do we do about it? Well, you know the answer, of course, but just show you a bit more glimpse behind it, is it takes us to the sugar tax, or you're not calling it sugar tax, it's called the levy, the added sugar levy, I think. The revenue prefer. Anyway, one of the key things is people just don't know. So look at the lemonades. There's 7-Up, sugar levels up here, versus, let's scan down to Sprite. And there's Tesco. I mean, how many of you, I should have asked you before, how many would you have guessed the difference, right? You're pretty smart people. You don't go into a supermarket like, okay, and you're not doing much substitution. But you will notice, as we've established, a certain price level, and retailers and producers know that. So one of the fascinating things about the sugar tax is we then track the impact after the announcement, just before the announcement, to what is sugar levels in different drinks. And guess what happens? It's like magic. So let's take a little contrast. There's a bit more, we see Sprite and blah, blah, blah. Before and 7-Up. Whoa! It's 2-level tax, sorry, for those who don't know it. Just, we think carefully about it. 8 grams and 5 grams. And of course, we deliberately put those thresholds in around certain key products. And then, we've got some more. Oh, look at that. So this is before the tax comes in. So it's anticipatory action by producers. So we have an 11% reduction in sugar just by the time the tax is coming in, by the time it's coming in. And by the way, just as in the micro experiments, there's actually been an increase in sales over the same period. So it's a beautiful policy instrument. Again, IFS told us it wouldn't work, actually, because, anyway, whatever. I won't be bitchy about it. Our models are better. But it just shows you just how powerful it is. Now, you might say this is not a nudge, but actually for us, it's deeply based on a reading of behavioural science and human behaviour that takes us to this point, including building up the evidence to be able to persuade, of course, not only Jeremy Hunt after the election and before, but then to get the PM on board and even the Chancellor. We can get into that. Okay. Right. A lot of work. Won't go through all it, but yes. Okay. So kind of final bit then, I'm going to go into a few other issues, wider approaches and tools. So if that stuff worked, what else might we be doing this on? So let's have a think. Well, one area, we had a lot of arguments, which we didn't run RCTs on, but electronic cigarettes. This really was a very substantial battle in the UK and indeed elsewhere. And we took a view by 2011, certainly, by 2011, that instead of, which government was on course essentially to ban e-cigarettes in Britain. That was the position. That was the position also we were briefing into Europe to say the UK position was to ban them. And we took a view based initially on, I won't go through all the evidence, but a number of bits of evidence where you've got an addictive behaviour particularly, and rather like, of course, aspartame and sugar, where what you want to try and do is not force extinction, but drive substitution. So, I mean, the history is generally known, but this is what happens with how people quit smoking, and very rapidly e-cigarettes became, well, over a couple of years, the dominant route through which smokers quit. The absolutely key variable and why they help to make progress is they improve the success of quit rates. So if we look here, that's the successful quit rates. And the key point you want to notice is how these move up, right? So, yeah, it makes it easier to quit, and it's more likely that you'll be successful in your quit attempts. So it's a really interesting policy lever. Maybe some people will disagree with them horribly. We could talk about that in discussion, but we think it's pretty good. And latest estimates, you might know, we're at about 22 estimates between 22,000 and 57,000 extra people quitting a year as a result of e-cigarettes. Okay, here's a really geeky one. Wouldn't it be good if we had lots of good data we could use in health, except that people don't really want to share their data? I mean, lots of questions. One of the things we now do is before you go and do some big survey, or, hey, why don't we just ask people in the following way? How do we know if that's the best way to do it? So we actually do a lot of online testing to see do people understand it and what works. So here's an example around, if you're asking people, do you want to share your data and do you want to opt out? Or you could ask them this, or in fact, the original formula was, instead of having 2 options, was to have 4 options, right? And the question is, even a simple question, do people even understand the difference? Well, that's something, it's an empirical question. So you can do online testing with samples and figure out what's the case. So you test the different variations, like that one, and then you see, well, let's then ask some simple factual questions afterwards. Do people understand what they just signed? That's with 4 options, this is the comprehension levels. That's with 2 options out of 5. Like, they just didn't understand. People didn't understand the variations between them. So we can do that before. You might think this about referendum in general. Work out what people will understand and what they won't is actually an empirical question. Okay. Here's another area which we do some work on, which is super exciting, which is machine learning. Why we're interested in that? Well, lots of reasons, but actually, if you think about it, machine learning is often itself a sort of form of experimentation, testing in very large data sets. And we're also interested in what kinds of often data, including behavioural cues, turn out to be predictions, and then beyond that, what would you then do with much, much more targeted interventions? So this is a cut on just one of the bits of work which we did, which is on, can you identify who's a really bad GP, basically, what CQC would call inadequate, which is only a very small percentage. And one of the reasons why we like this one particularly is CQC very helpfully publish a lot of how they go around sending their lots of inspectors. So let's just take it at, imagine you've got enough inspectors. It took them, 3 years to do full inspections, one full inspection of all our GPs in Britain, right? To give you a background. So what you're essentially retrospectively seeing is, could you do better? So if you took you only got enough inspectors to go to, say, 20% of all GPs in the following year, by randomly you'd get 20% of the inadequates as well. See what I mean? Yeah? Which would be a small number. CQC do target their inspections using a number of criteria, and this is our best model of their targeted hit rate, which is about 32%. How well does a machine learning model, and what does that mean? That means throwing everything into it, but I'll explain it if you want. How well does a machine learning model perform to predict? It's at 95%. So we can take and mine existing data and identify 95% of the inadequates from a 20% sample. And how the hell can we do that? Well, it's because there's just loads of other information, which when you mesh it together, it becomes predictive. So for example, you can look at the prescription rates, which we touched on earlier, and we say, well, for your given population, which by the way, we're then putting in from all the census data, you've got this many middle-aged men, what level of certain prescriptions or referral to hospitals would you expect to see? And then you can, without actually having to have a clear hypothesis before, you can say, is it predictive? In fact, in this case, you might think, is a bad GP one who's prescribing way too much medication or way too little as calibrated against a CQC judgment? It turns out when we build the model, we find, incidentally, in this particular case, underprescription is predictive of being an inadequate GP, along with many other factors. So it means you can do lots of things. You might decide, well, I don't need so many inspectors. Or more usefully, you might think, you know what, we could identify much earlier which GPs are inadequate and go along and try and give them some extra support, right? And then you can think about what are the interventions, behavioural and others, to do. So it's an incredibly exciting field. Where next? Any other things? Well, one question is, where else can we go in relation to other key challenges or from other domains? So one key challenge a lot of us are thinking about is, this is one from another area actually, is can we take from other areas? So we do interventions in many other areas. One of our favourite recent ones was around how can you mobilise support around an individual to do something, right? You might have called it big society once upon a time, who knows? This was done for kids in school, but imagine apply it to kind of long-term conditions. You want someone to change their behaviour. You're coming home, actually I'm supposed to change my diet. You want other people around you, right, to support you in that change, potentially. So in this case, this intervention was done with kids who are in FE colleges. So for those who don't know it, if you fail your maths and English these days in Britain, you have to go back to college and retake. So our FE colleges are full of kids who didn't enjoy doing maths and English much first time, and hey, guess what, guys? You've got to do it again. And if you fail, you've got to do it again. It's really hard to legislate and say, would you at the back please concentrate this time around, or even in centres of problematic. So, does it make a difference? Yeah, what we do is we send texts. For those who've got a 15-year-old kid, you can get this, or we'll look at the time. That's a good cue. I'll get to the end then. Essentially what we do is we send these texts. I'll just give you the answer. It goes, they nominate 2 people, they get some information, say this is what we're doing at school, blah, blah, blah. And then do we get a difference? We randomise amongst those people who opt in. So that says 22%, it should say. Yeah, we get from 22 to 28%. It's basically it's around a quarter increase in the pass rate by mobilising around the individual. There's lots of health examples we think for that. I'll just rattle through 2 minutes. Self-harm, we're really interested in self-harm, particularly the rise in girls in both sides of the Atlantic. Social media seems to be the smoking gun is over it. This is a really nice bit of work actually by the Royal Society of Public Health, getting 1,500 young people to say, what's the impact it has on you? Look at this one, the contrast between these ones. This one is like, oh, both of them are really bad for your sleep, but this one's really bad for lots of things like body image and anxiety, depression, whereas this one's not. Can you guess which one's which? This one is Instagram, folks. Don't give your 15-year-old, 14-year-old, 12-year-old Instagram. Where's this YouTube? So it's a form of de-shrouding. Can you reveal this and put a pressure on the social media giants where actually, for God's sake, don't put, have a smartphone for your kid, but don't give them Instagram, but let them have YouTube. All right, so you can rank it, do social trust. In conclusion, what else might you do? Yeah. Inside the Nudge Unit, the Nudge Unit now reasonably famous. I think we take some comfort from that. But there's lots still to do. There's lots of people who use behavioural techniques for bad as well as good, right? And we just have to bear that in mind, and certainly in relation to health. There are lots of ideas that don't work. This is scared straight for those who don't know it. Fantastic idea, great. It unfortunately increases offending by about 60%, we think. But in conclusion, which is really the last, is I do think we will look back on it, rather like we look at Lynn's stuff, and think like, what the hell were we doing? We were basing a lot of policy in many areas on these really weird, naive theories of human behaviour. And when you introduce a better model, you get better predictions. And also, just empirically testing it. I mean, one thing health has always had going, a certain kind of empiricism. We shouldn't leave that only in relation to pharmaceutical type activities. We should be doing it on everything. So, very good. I'll stop there, and I'm sorry I've overrun a bit. You can read that. Okay. I love that nudge. That's just walk on.
I don't know how effective it was. But anyway, we've got time for some questions through the groups. So I've got one hand there. So I've got 3 questions. So I'm going to take these 3 questions first of all. So you've got mics. Yep. All sitting together. So
Hello. What would be the top nudge you would recommend to reduce rates of violence against women and girls, and in general, improve the situation of children learning from porn rather than from real life?
Oh boy. Okay.
An easy one to start with.
You take it through at a time, right? Is that what you're doing?
Oh, okay. Do you do any follow-up studies on some of these? It strikes me that some of them could be susceptible to the novelty effect. And I'd like to hear how you've accounted for that.
It was here, sorry.
Thanks. I've got two questions. The first is about smart meters, which I think the public discussion was a lot about how there would be a behavioural impact, how it would be worth the £9 billion. My understanding is it hasn't been, and I was wondering if you've got thoughts about that. And the second one is about Facebook. Because I was in a conversation the other day about how much power Facebook have with respect to how much power governments have at the moment. And that conversation didn't take in at all the kind of framing that Facebook get to do and the norms that Facebook get to set. And I was interested in your view about how much invisible effect Facebook have on our behaviour through those mechanisms.
All right. Easy peasy stuff. Okay, on violence in women and girls, we've certainly been doing some work on it, and of course we look at others. We're doing, I'm not saying we've got all the answers. Do we think there's some promising things? Yes, it's not one single thing. We're doing a really interesting intervention on domestic violence in Australia, which has got 3 elements to it. We've got the first 2 out, which have been effective. The most ambitious one is in the field, which is essentially using implementation intentions. We hope it's going to be very effective too. There are often, interestingly, oblique effects. So like the South Dakota work, which is reductions in alcohol, interventions on alcohol seem to reduce violence quite markedly, can be pretty significant. It also depends on context. We're doing some work in refugee camps to try and reduce violence, and not least in classrooms, actually, is one of the key places it occurs. Again, with some pretty positive responses. We haven't done much on porn. Interesting, I tell you who's obsessed with it is, maybe that's not the right phrase, is Dan Ariely, who thinks it's a really interesting topic. And there are a few other people too. And it's a particular problem because it's not just porn, actually, but there's a lot of extreme imagery which is well beyond porn, and the numbers are extraordinary, so the police don't know what to do with it. In fact, we had this discussion, didn't we, once, interesting, about, so we were trying to work out, so the police would sometimes work out, you might have 70,000 names appear on a list, and you can't go and see 70,000 people, but we could send them a message, potentially, when you're on the site, and then should we send them a message saying, you really want to be looking at this? Or, what would be the most effective message? And we were very interested in running a trial. And actually, one of the questions was it be ethically wrong to do so? Because a lot of it hints on what do you think the displacement effect would be. So we think, it's a really interesting area, and I won't try and answer all of it, but we certainly have some things which look promising. On the novelty stuff, yes, we sometimes do, we often don't. I mean, if Wellcome would like to give us a real big pile of money, that would be wonderful, and we could do more follow-ups, or maybe others will do. But we do sometimes get to do them. And the answer is sometimes you see reductions and sometimes you don't. And it depends on the nature of the behaviour. I mean, one of the most studied ones is around O power in electricity, telling you how much energy do you use relative to your neighbours. Very good paper by Rogers and others. And testing what happens when you stop giving those cues. And you see a gradual decay of the effect. You lose about half the effect over time. And it goes down. In fact, we know exactly how fast it goes down. And why do you only get half? Because it's 2 things going on. Part of it is it's giving you the cue, like, oh my God, and you go around the house switching off all the lights and swearing at your kids. But the other half is you actually just start putting in double glazing and whatever and physically change it, which then doesn't require maintenance. So that's why you're seeing both effects in that sort of area. In fact, OPAL has done so much work, you can work it's roughly a quarterly basis is enough to keep prompting you to go around doing the lights bit and the other stuff. But, we do have some. And the general story, I think, is does the intervention encourage you to do something which you sort of wanted to do anyway, number one, and also was it a one-off? Sometimes a one-off change is fine. If we got you to insulate your home, we don't need you to do it every week. But with a lot of health behaviours, it's more chronic than that or sustained. And then the question often is either does it lead to some other spillover effect, like it changes the equilibrium, like on sugar, Or otherwise, is it getting you to do something that you want to do anyway? So particularly if it's novel and getting you to do something about which you're a bit ambivalent, you're like, oh yeah, I've seen this trick before. So one of our, we did a lot of work on giving because David Cameron was interested in giving behaviour too. And one of our trials was getting investment bankers to give a day of their salary to charity, which turned out to be a lot of money, by the way. And the baseline condition, you got about 5% of people who get a leaflet when they come in and an email from the boss. If when they get given the leaflet, with the leaflet was this tiny tub of sweets, sorry, but it was small, it increased the giving rate by nearly 2.5-fold, 12.5%. But we were actually curious about it. We were able to rerun it in a different sample, interlocking sample. And you can see for those people the next year who'd never seen it, it's exactly the same, 12.5%. For those who'd seen it last year, it drops to 9%. It's like, oh yeah, I've seen this one. You know what I mean? Okay, so but there are lots of interesting answers, and it's a totally key question. Smart meters and Facebook. Smart meters, we have done an RCT, but very complicated. We did a propensity score matching design for reasons I won't go into to try and work it. And we did conclude smart meters did have a behavioural effect. But one of the things that, guys, it's not clear which bit of the smart meter it is. So a lot of the expense is in the display and all the rest of it. It's not clear that some of the expensive bits are the bits that are doing the heavy lifting versus the smart bit and whatever. So it doesn't look like it's all wasted. Facebook, yeah, I mean, super interesting. I obviously just touched on that very briefly. There are lots of reasons why we're interested in social media. And in fact, what takes probably the most of my time more than anything else is what you would probably call market design. There's like sugar tax type issues. And that certainly applies around social media. So a colleague of mine has done an estimate to work out how much computing power does Facebook use to design and shape your news feed. And his estimate, which is really neat, because they don't publish it, but you can work out actually their energy use of Facebook. And from that, you can derive an estimate of how much computing power they're using. Anyway, so his estimate is that it's about 25 times the computing power that was used by IBM's Deep Blue to beat Kasparov, right? That's what's being used on your net. That's quite a lot of computational power to keep your attention. But it raises lots of questions around attentional capture, which does the heads of regulators, because if you're not paying for it, blah, 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 what can you do about it? I won't try and give you the answers, but we actually think, a lot of countries seem to have given up, they think we've lost, whereas we don't think that's true. When you understand the micro behavior well enough, as well as the market design, you can design much, much more precise interventions which change it in the way you want to, basically. So forgive me if I don't go into lots of detail, but the answer is very, very interesting area.
Okay, we're going to have one more round of questions. So I want very short questions, short answers, and then David drinks. David can talk more while you drink. I've got one there, and one there. So if you want to start, yeah.
So you mentioned about the RCTs, and but there is a lot of literature already which is available that the academics have done over the last 20, 30 years. So I just want to know, before you conduct a trial yourself, do you look at the evidence which is already there? I understand the point to make about the Wellcome Trust and giving you some more money to do a longitudinal trial, but the evidence which already exists may shows different to what is being claimed in a way. And then again, the nudge unit being very close to the government, there can be a criticism that the policy has already been decided and using RCTs is just a means to an end.
Okay, over here, yes.
Do you have any insights around nudges or other things that can be used to encourage people who are, say, overtly racist or homophobic to change behaviour?
Yeah, it's a slightly academic point in some ways. But I was interested in the point you made about nudges versus incentives, but also about the costs of behaviour. Because you could argue that nudges really only affect behaviours that aren't that costly to the individual in the first instance to change. So if you're thinking about behaviours that may be perceived as being very costly to the individual to change, how can these approaches deal with those kind of instances?
Very good. All right. RCTs, well, of course we look at the existing evidence. Do we look at it well enough? Perhaps not. I mean, one of the things I also do a day a week is I serve ministers as National Advisor on What Works, which is essentially involves we've been creating a series of institutions which do a lot of that bridging. So both to mine the existing evidence. I mean, an obvious example would be in education, the Educational Endowment Foundation, which has essentially gone over every single bit of educational research you can find in the world, 11,000 odd studies, summarised it, produced its toolkit, work out what the gaps are, and then has been busy trying to plug the gaps. It's run now more than 120, 130 randomised controlled trials in British schools. In fact, more than 1 million kids in Britain have gone through randomised controlled trials organised by the EF in the last 6 years.
But I just say, for anybody who's interested in this, I think that this really is a quiet revolution.
Absolutely.
Look up a report that was published in January this year on the first 5 years of the What Works network. And it's such a thrilling read with figures like that in terms of the amount of evidence that's being generated across the 10 centres. Might not always find its way into policy.
So should we use the, I mean, obviously also aimed at informing practice on the ground. There's a guy, Jonathan Shepherd, you probably know, actually, he's a facial surgeon, but has a graph I often use, which shows the number of randomised controlled trials in medicine in the last whatever, and it does this fantastic thing, you know, along comes Archie Cochrane and woo, up we go. And then everything else, and it's like this, you know. So I would love to have the problem, which is, oh my God, someone already did 3 RCTs on this issue. That is generally not true in most areas of policy, I assure you. And on your point about, are we just kind of doing the policy and then doing the RCT afterwards? Really not, really not. I mean, if you already knew the answer, not least on ethical grounds, you shouldn't do an RCT if you know what it's going to do, right? We're actually really trying to, I haven't got time to go into it, but why it is quite profound is you're actually trying to change how we do policy, not only in Britain, but in other countries. So, you know, Whitehall is full of notes flying around going to ministers saying, you've looked at it very, very carefully, thought about it, minister, these are like the 5 options, this one would be terrible, this one would be pretty awful, you know, but we think you should go for C. Whereas actually they should have just say, honestly, we have no bloody idea. But the good news is we're going to do several versions of this policy, and then we're going to figure out which is more effective. So boring but important territory is we just recently, HM government rewrote the Green Book, which is the guides how you make policy. And one of the key changes, like first time in 18 years, I think, one of the key changes in it is instead of like you should do an evaluation, do your intervention and do your cost-benefit analysis, and in the end it will be a good idea to evaluate. Now it actually says, no. Build into your policy practice deliberate variation wherever you can to find out and refine. It's like marginal gains territory. This is a profoundly different way of doing policy. And the most importantly, it's rooted on humility. It's absolutely, so I'm contesting, I guess, what your principal point is, an acknowledgement of we generally don't know what will happen. And there are all these other possibilities and choices, we better try and explore them. And the exciting thing is, God, imagine we did which has been done in pharmaceutical, I mean, a bit rude about it at the beginning, applied those kind of techniques on all other areas of social policy. God, imagine what we can discover.
One sentence answers to the other two
Sorry.
questioners, and
Sorry,
then we're
drink.
all going to go downstairs.
I wish I could read my own writing. What was the second one? Discrimination. Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Well, I'm lending that little, no, I'll just the other one first, which was on cost. Yeah, look, there's a reasonable hypothesis where it would work and when it wouldn't. And one of the key questions is working out, in fact, not only that, but what kind of intervention will work and when, for who. And so it's a reasonable hypothesis. It involves quite a lot of cost then, you know, blah, blah, blah. But not the only factor. For this one about, racism and blah, blah, blah. But one graph I flipped over because I was already in trouble on time was this sort of social trust graph. I can't remember who asked that question on race and so on. But sorry, yes. So look, the kind of things actually that rips apart societies, for the most part, is not that we ate too much or something that kills us. 2 wars start every year roughly in the world, right? Half of which are reignitions of previous conflicts. Average cost of a war is about $100 billion, let alone human costs. You know, things we see domestically too. In fact, even social trust, do you think other people can be trusted, is an incredibly powerful variable, how you feel about other people. And even my little example at the beginning, In fact, buried under that is you're avoiding other people because you don't really like them and you're afraid of them or whatever. So it is absolutely of profound importance. So we are working on a number of fronts. I wouldn't say we've got all the answer. It goes from the very micro. So for example, we've been working around National Citizen Service, which is designed to create bridging social capital. But one of the issues is 15% of kids never turn up. So we're working on interventions both to increase social trust inside it, but even to get them to turn up. We've been able to halve the dropout rate by introducing kids a month in advance to someone else. And incidentally, it's even more effective if you introduce them to someone who is different by race or some other significant variable. The dropout rate falls even further, which is really neat. And right at the other extreme, I won't give you lots of examples, but in between, the Holocaust Memorial being built in Westminster. People have got grand thoughts about how it would be good to stop it ever happening again. Well, we could just have it as a kind of arty thing and just, why? So we're trying to work out from the outset, what do we know from behavioural and social science would tell us the design not only of that experience, but also the educational content that would make that more likely to be true. How could you design a set of experiences? And even our advice is in the design of the entity itself is, for God's sake, let's not fix it. Let us build the capacity to run trials and variations even inside that space, right, to change its effect, to make it more effective. So yes, we're totally with you, and we have some glimmers of hope. Let me put it no stronger than that.
Well, on that glimmer of hope, join me in thanking David very much for having come such in a bad chair. We've gone over by 10 minutes. There's only 20 minutes left for the reception, so please move swiftly to get downstairs. And David, I'm sure, will carry on engaging.
Sorry, we have so much material. This is just on us.
Well, it gives people a sense